Hey y'all, it's Saturday night, and welcome to my den. Uh, you're stuck at home, I'm stuck at home. Um, we're missing out on a lot of things now that we'd normally do at this time of the year. In fact, this is a really busy season for me, with libraries, and I probably had a dozen that had to postpone. I also had several art festivals who also either canceled or postponed. So life is certainly different. Um, Here's the thing. A lot of y'all, I mean, we have almost 88,000 people, 188,000 people on the page. And most of y'all obviously have never seen one of my programs. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to give you an abbreviated version so you get an idea of what to expect should this all blow over and we go back to, quasi normal. So here we go. Just a little bit of a disclaimer. I really wanted to do this live. Unfortunately, Beth, who runs Alabama the Beautiful, and I were working on this, and we pretty much got the mechanics down. Everything was fine. The problem is the live part of it was very unreliable. In fact, the picture would freeze. Sometimes it would just stop completely. I mean, it was so bad that I decided that we just need to put this to tape. So here we go. How y'all doing tonight? Thank y'all for joining me. Let me tell y'all a little bit about myself. While I was not born in Alabama, I was born in North Carolina. We moved to Huntsville in 1958. I grew up there, graduated from high school, eventually finished at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I was on the 8 years into 4 plan. 4 years into 8, whatever. It took me a while to get out of college. I worked a few jobs along the way before I eventually ended up as a part-time videotape editor at the CBS station in Huntsville. That eventually became a full-time position as a photographer. I worked a handful of TV stations along the way before I finally ended up at WVTM in Birmingham, NBC 13. First as a photographer, as an assignment editor, a job I absolutely despise, I will never do again as long as I live. And my last job was operating a satellite truck. If you don't know what a satellite truck is, it's a big box truck. It's got a dish on the roof, and you're looking for satellites in geosynchronous orbit above the equator. If that doesn't mean anything to you, if you ever see these fools standing on a beach reporting about a hurricane, I made that happen. In my 8 years at Channel 13, plus the years following when I was freelancing, I wrote out 8 hurricanes. Another aspect of my job when I was at Channel 13 was I spent a lot of time on the road. In just my 8 years there, I probably drove close to 250,000 miles, which means I saw a lot of Alabama. It was the fall of 2007. I was going to Auburn. I go down US 280. That was the standard way to go. Probably about, I don't know, halfway between Childersburg and Sylacauga was this old rusting 1957 Chevy Bel Air that's sitting up on the side of the road. I had a little time to kill, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to check this thing out. Well, it turns out what you can't see from the road, because there's a little bit of a rise there, there's about 30 or 40 acres of ancient rusting cars. I mean, dating back to the 1920s, nothing was newer than the mid-1960s. It was truly a fascinating time capsule of rust. The problem was I didn't have a camera with me. I said I'm never going anywhere else without a camera. As I continued my travels, I started to see other things. An old abandoned country house in the middle of nowhere. A store in a rural intersection that had been closed for 30, 40 years, a sign for a business that didn't exist anymore. I started to see these things everywhere. And while I had been thinking about some form of forgotten Alabama for years, it really was starting to hit home with me that this is something I really, really need to see about doing. Finally, like I said, I mentioned before, I did freelance, so I wound up having a lot of time on my hands. So what I did was, in December 2017, I got me a little Nikon camera, and I hopped in my old Dodge truck and just went out, drove around to see what there was to see. I was very random. I was very disorganized. I was very much a guy who didn't read the directions. I could literally drive 150 to 200 miles a day. I might see 3 different things. This was getting me nowhere. It's going to take me the rest of my life, the rest of my next life, to actually accomplish this. So what I needed to do was come up with a plan to make this happen in a much more efficient manner. All right, as I stated, the way I was doing it was going to take the rest of my life and probably the rest of my next life too. So I needed to come up with a more organized way to do it. So in the summer of 2013, I sat down at my computer and came up with a plan. What I did was I broke the state up into 16 sections, a grid pattern here, 16 roughly equal sections. Each one of them has a name. Down the lower right there, that's Lower Alabama East. Up there in the northwest corner there, that's Upper Alabama Northwest. And what I did was I go to Google satellite maps, and I started scanning every mile of every state and every federal highway in the entire state of Alabama. And what I was looking for when I did this, I found that in PowerPoint. It was so cool I couldn't pass it up. But anyway, what I'm doing is I'm scanning down the highway, looking for anything that would catch my eye, and I actually got pretty good at this. I would find things, like this. Obviously, a lot of y'all know this is no drive-in. Every time Street View was an option, I'd come down and take a look at it and see if it was worth shooting. That's a cool old movie screen, down in Chilton County, and obviously that's worth, documenting. So I'd come back out, I'd put a pin in the map, I'd obviously identify it, and then I'd move on down the road, start going and looking for the next thing. And that next thing wound up becoming 10 things, and those 10 things wound up becoming 100 things. And ultimately, and this has taken several years, a lot of it's my own research. Sometimes people will post things on the page I wasn't aware of. Ultimately, everything wound up being a pin on this map. And I've probably driven by at least 95% of these. I haven't shot all of them, obviously, but I've shot a great deal of them. Now, what am I looking for when I shoot these things? We see all these places meant something to somebody, and I wanted to capture them in an aesthetically, that's easy for me to say, aesthetically pleasing way. So, perfect example here is this Google screenshot of this old abandoned garage in downtown Dothan. Now, to look at it, it's not much to see. I mean, it's not really that attractive a building. What I really liked was right there in the middle there was those doors there. They were trifold doors. They collapsed either side. This is before there was such a thing as a roll-up door. The morning I was there, it's probably about, what was it? It was February 2014, probably about 7 o'clock in the morning. The sun was just blazing. It was, shooting on days like this are always a challenge. I took this shot and I absolutely hated it. What am I going to do with this? It's too bright. The building's not very attractive. There's nothing about this shot I liked. Then happened to see the shadow there from the street light, and the shadow's going through the window there. So I thought, you know what? I'm here. I'm going to go around the alley and see if I can make something out of this. And lo and behold, I actually did make a silk purse out of a Salzar here. I probably, by now, shot around 45,000 photographs. It's still one of my top 10 favorites. Over in Goodwater, that's in Coosa County, this is one of 3 former casket factories. Casket manufacturing was a big part of the economic base there. It was a big enough deal that they used to have casket festivals and casket races. Ultimately, steel became a cheaper material to manufacture with, and all of these went out of business. It was also a kind of a railroad hub. The railroads changed the way they did business. What all this led up to is it pretty much killed off the town's economy to the point where Goodwater is pretty much a shell of what it used to be. Over in Fawnsdale, that's in Marengo County, it's a tiny little town, probably no more than 100 people there, but they had this really cool old water tower. I mean, this thing's 150 feet tall, something like that. It's got it's old, it's rusty, you got a cone shape on the top of it. I just had to get a shot of it. While I was there, I noticed a tiny little brick building behind it, maybe 50, 75 yards behind it. And since I'm here, I'll go back and take a look at it. Well, it turns out that happened to be when it stuck my head in the door. It's like, oh, cool, it's a jail, and it literally is the jail. This is the entire jail. You're looking at the whole thing right there. I got back on the back of the bunk. I shot back, the other way, so I kind of get this cool shot. I actually wound up having it framed. I call it Down in the Hole. If anybody ever asks me if I've been in jail, I can say, well, technically yes. Down in Conecuh County, just south of Evergreen, is the old Fairview Tourist Courts. They were built in 1935 by two brothers named Hanna. The interesting thing about how the highways work here is it's at the intersection of Highway 82, U.S. Highway 82, and U.S. Highway 31. And what happens is when 82 intersects, it splits both north and south. And what all this did was it created this big triangle right here in the middle. So the Hanna brothers, built 6 cabins here. They wound up adding a gas station. Let's see what else. They have a restaurant, a dance hall. They had all sorts of amenities here, and they were catching tourists on their way to their beach. They were catching tourists coming from every direction. Ultimately, things started to slow down because the state was building Interstate 65. And in fact, this Alabama Department of Transportation employees used to live here while they were working on the highway. After the road was built, they all moved on. The Fairview Tourist Courts went into decline to the point where they eventually shut down in the early 1990s. Everything is gone except for the original 6 cabins, which were built, 85 years ago. Down in Atmore, that's in Escambia County, I've been doing the library there. When I got done, some lady with a newspaper said, hey, you want to go see a jail on wheels? And I said, oh, duh. So we head out to the edge of town to a big salvage yard. It was huge. Had to go out in the owner's pickup truck to get way out to it. This is where I usually ask when I have a live audience, how many of y'all had seen the movie Cool Hand Luke? And, a handful would, and I'd say, then you remember the chain gangs. They'd go out and they'd work on the county roads with picks and shovels. Well, the problem was it was a lot of trouble getting people up, fed, loaded up, taken to the work site, then do everything in reverse at the end of the day. So somebody came up with this bright idea, why not have an RV for convicts? So the Manley Steel Corporation, they're out of Dalton, Georgia, they wound up building what was known as a rolling jail. It had bunks in it, had a stove, they covered it with canvas at night to keep the weather out, and the convicts would actually camp out on the work site. Up in Huntsville, this is a quirky piece of Alabama history. This is a 1947 Keller super chief. George Keller, he was a sales executive with Studebaker, and he decided, you know what, I want to go into the car business myself. So he got some investors together, some engineers. He leased some chemical munitions buildings out at Redstone Arsenal, and he started the Keller Car Company. By 1948, he had around 90 people on payroll and around 1,600 dealers across the country ready to carry the Keller. By 1949, he had all his financing and means of production in place when he dropped dead of a heart attack at the age of 56. The company tried to survive without him. Eventually, they wound up shutting their doors in 1950. Only 18 Kellers were ever made. Only 3 are known to still exist. Down in Baldwin County, this is the keel of the merchant schooner Rachel. She was built, around 1900. When she was actually been lost for years and years until she was uncovered by a tropical storm, I don't know, like 8-10 years ago. And there was all sorts of crazy rumors about, the origins of the Rachel, as a commerce raider, crazy things like that. No, she was a merchant schooner. She was the seagoing equivalent of a tractor trailer. She used to run lumber back and forth between Alabama and Cuba. Sometime in 1925, a tropical storm beached her. She survived intact. The boat's owner got every tugboat he could find to try and drag her back into the Gulf. Ultimately, he was unsuccessful, and he stripped it of everything that was usable and abandoned it. Much longer after that, somebody else came along and burned it to the ground, presumably to salvage the iron nails out of it. Time, the weather, and tourists have not been kind to the Rachel, and she's slowly vanishing. I figure for 2-3 years from now, there'll be almost nothing left to see. Over in Hale County, just south of Moundville, this is Green Chapel CME Church. It's built in 1893. Now, I've been in a lot of abandoned churches in Alabama, and they all look essentially the same. You got your pews, you got your altar, you got your ceiling fans with the missing blades. I mean, pretty much nothing defines one from the next. What I really liked this one is these silk flowers sitting up here near the front. I mean, somebody placed those there. It was, loving hands set there. It was like, it became my focal point, like life in an otherwise dead place. The thing is other people on my Forgotten Alabama page, which y'all are quite aware of, well, they also know about the church. They also go in there and they also shoot pictures. And sometimes they'll move the basket around. That annoys me. So every time I'm close to the church, I will stop by and check on my flowers. If they're not where they're supposed to be, I will pick them back and put them on this post. Over in Shelby, which is in Shelby County, this is the Shelby Hotel. I originally thought, well, actually there was an older hotel called the Dannemora, which was built in 1863. I thought it served as a hospital for the Confederacy, but apparently there was another hotel down the road. The Dannemora burned in 1891. The Shelby was built in 1900. Said to be the very first hotel in Alabama to have both running water and electricity. Sadly, in May of last year, it also burned to the ground. Apparently, they did say it was arson. However, I've never heard what became of that. Down in Monroe County, this is an old railroad tunnel of the L&N Railroad. It's built in 1899. 3 crews of 15 people each using simple hand tools worked 24 hours a day. It took them about several months to actually build this entire thing. The railroad used it for many years, and eventually they abandoned it probably about 30 or 40 years ago. They pulled up all the tracks. There's not really much left to see here, except, for the tunnel entrances on either end. I've seen videos of people driving their Jeeps through this thing and all like that. It's also home for thousands of bats. Over in Randolph County, in the little town of Roanoke, is the famous Elephant gas station. It was built sometime in the 1930s. It actually didn't start out looking this way, but it did have kind of an unusual shape to it. Because the original intent was, all right, well, let's put it this way. It sat on what was called the Florida Shortcut, which was US 431. So what they did with the roof of this is make it like a tropical island. It had cliffs, it had a lighthouse, and it would catch tourists on their way to the beach. Eventually, the lighthouse made the roof leak, so they had to remove it. The station went out of business. It eventually became a used car lot. And the lot's owner wound up doing this extension that you see there to the right that looks like an elephant's trunk, which I'm assuming somebody pointed out to him that it looked like that, so he painted the eye on it, and hence it became the famous Elephant gas station. Near as I can figure, this has sat abandoned for at least 35, 40 years. Down in Covington County, I was on my way to Red Level when I happened to pass this cool old farmhouse. And I didn't know it existed. Apparently they clear cut the land recently. So, I'm not one to pass up a cool looking farmhouse. So I whooped around, made sure I got a shot of it, because, it was just a perfect setting. And things like this are why I do what I do, because probably maybe 2-3 years ago it got struck by lightning and burned to the ground. So I'll never have another chance to see it. Up in Somerville, this is up near Decatur. Somerville was established as the county seat of Cataco County about a week before Alabama became a state in 1819. Their first order of business was to build a jail for $137.50. Oh, and by the way, Cataco County was renamed Morgan County in 1821. In 1825, they decided they wanted to build a permanent jail, so hence the structure you see here. It was a jail. It was also a post office and a polling station, and from time to time people have lived in it. Near as anybody can figure, nobody's been in the house, lived in the house for at least 30 or 40 years. Up in Florence, northwest side of Florence, this is the old Forks of Cyprus, so named because it was built at the intersection, the fork of, the Big and Little Cypress Creeks. It was designed by a well-known architect named William Nichols, who happened to design many of the buildings, the older buildings at the University of Alabama campus. It was owned by an Irish immigrant named James Jackson. Near as I could figure, all he did for a living was raise racehorses. It stayed in the family for many years before it changed hands several times. Ultimately, it wound up becoming a museum until it got struck by lightning in 1966 and burned to the ground. If you're familiar with this, if you've ever seen it, it's way off the road. So if you're seeing it like this, I'm trespassing. I happened to track down the owner. It's actually a married couple. They're both doctors. And I asked if it was okay to be there, and he said, sure. And I told him I was coming up the next day, and he said, just give him a call when I was getting close. I said, okay. I was probably about half an hour out. I called him up, and he said he's got too many things going on and just climbed the fence. So, don't have to tell me twice. Down in Bayou La Batre in Mobile County is this crazy-looking submersible vehicle. When it first showed up, I think back in the late 1980s, people came up with all these crazy stories that this was, a Soviet spy submarine or something like that. Partially yes, partially no. It is Soviet, and it was built in between 1968 and 1972, which is pretty much right smack in the middle of the Cold War, but that's where it ends. This is the Severbis 2, Severbis 2. It was the sister ship to the Severbis, and these were used for their research vessels. They did oceanographic research. They inspected fisheries, things like that. Eventually, they were taken out of service and left to rust in some shipyard in the Soviet Union when some enterprising American found this thing, bought it, brought it back to the Steiner shipyard in Bayou La Batre. In fact, if you're familiar with Bayou La Batre, there's literally, the drawbridge is probably about 100 feet to the left of this. And anyway, the story goes that he was going to patch it up and do undersea tours of the Gulf of Mexico. Sometime in the early 1990s, apparently he told them that the boat, I'm not sure who he told, but he mentioned that he was going out of town, and nobody's seen or heard from him ever since. Over in Henry County, just west of Abbeville, this is Rosa Parks' childhood home. She was not born here, but she did grow up here. The house is in very poor condition. When I actually did the library in Abbeville and asked the librarian what the deal was, and he said, well, the house sits on private land and the owner does not want to sell, but apparently also doesn't have the money to fix it up. I actually checked on it a little over a year ago when I was down there, and the windows were boarded up, but it was in worse shape than the last time I saw it. Near as I can figure, it will probably eventually collapse where it sits. Over in Red Bay, this is in Franklin County, this is a really, really cool find. This is an old water tower for the Illinois Central Railroad. Now, just so you know, the train station was built there in 1908, 1909, somewhere in that neighborhood. So this water tower probably dates from that same time. Back then, steam engines needed lots of water, and this, obviously to produce steam. It's only one of these I've ever seen in person, and this is exactly as it sat for all these years. Over in Talladega County, just north of Childersburg, is the last remaining remnant of the Alabama ammunition plant. This is a significant part of Alabama history that few people know about. It was built by DuPont in 1941. Its specific goal was to manufacture munitions, explosive powders, for the war effort. At its height, it had around 25,000 people working here, and it's cranking out about 40 million pounds of ammunition a month. Towards the latter part of the war, it was also involved in the production of heavy water, which was used for the atomic bomb. After the war was over, it was put on standby. They eventually closed it down in August of 1945. Some point after that, they tried leasing out some of the buildings there for commercial purposes. Ultimately, it came to be discovered that the ground was highly contaminated from all this munitions production, so much so that it wound up being an EPA Superfund site. When I finally made it down here, it was like I wandered all over here, and I'm really grateful they cleaned it up, because I'd probably be glowing by now. Down in northern Autauga County is the tiny little town of Billingsley. Now, you remember, I told you I'm looking at satellite maps, and I'm seeing things from, a satellite perspective. And this is the very first town that I discovered with the town's name emblazoned on the roof of a large building. This happens to be this store here. And I wondered what the deal was with that. It was like they have this huge ego or something like that. No, not only that, they didn't plan ahead, so they had to hyphenate. As it turns out, when you see writing on typically they were on, cotton gins like that. When you see the town's name there, there's a reason for that. Back in the late 1930s, the Department of Commerce set up the Airways Marking Commission, and its specific purpose was to paint the town's name on a large structure in town and every town in America. And the reason, you might ask, so pilots would know where they were and how to navigate. This practice continued through World War II. In fact, just towards the latter part of the war, towns on the eastern seaboard actually had to paint over their roofs so the Germans wouldn't know where they were if they had long-range bombers. After the war was over, radar was fairly common, and the practice was abandoned in the late 1940s. In fact, in my travels in Alabama, I've probably seen easily a dozen of these painted roofs, and I know their significance. Oh, just an aside, this building was torn down, so I'll never be able to shoot it again either. North of Guntersville is two almost nearly identical cabin cruisers. Now, remember, I worked in TV in Huntsville, and one of the things I remember was as we were going down to Guntersville and covered a story, and I remember we were coming back north on Highway 431, and I saw these two cool old cabin cruisers here. And keep in mind, this is like 1988, 1989, so what was that, 31, 32 years ago. Well, when I finally started shooting Forgotten Alabama, and this is probably 2015 when I finally got over here, and I thought, I wonder if those boats still exist. So I drove by, and lo and behold, there they were in much worse shape than they were the last time. And I was stunned, because that was, what, 25 years, 26 years later, and they're still there. And it was just an amazing find. A friend of mine went down and, checked on them for me, I don't know, maybe a year ago, and she let me know that they had totally collapsed. Over in DeKalb County, it's really cool old church that I didn't even know existed. I was actually going up to Mentone. You can't really see it there, but up to the left there's a road that goes up to Mentone. I was going to go shoot something over closer to the Georgia line, and they had clear cut this valley. And I actually spotted a church down at the end of that dirt road, and I made a note, I need to come back by here and get a shot of it. And when I finally got back down here, I turned the corner, I found this church. And this church is way cooler than the other one. So, obviously I got a shot of it, as you can see. The problem was I couldn't find out the name of it. I called around, I emailed people, nobody seemed to know the name. I finally gave up, just published it in my first book, never actually knowing. Probably around January 2016, I was up at, Sequoia Caverns. There's a barn up on Highway 11 there. And paint on the back of it is how far it is to New Orleans, how far it is to New York. And I wanted to get a shot of it. The problem was there's no place to park, so I had to pull off the road, park perpendicular to the road. It's the only time in all my travels that, well, actually that's not true. I got stuck earlier this year. But the first time I got stuck, I've only been stuck twice. The problem was, I was on the road to a closed tourist attraction, that being Sequoia Caverns, and it was a dead-end road, and it's not like I was going to have a lot of opportunities to flag down help. Probably about 45 minutes later, two guys from the Valley Head Water Department happened to be driving up the road, so I ran out in the road and flagged them down and said, "Can y'all pull me out?" And they said, "Sure." And they wrapped a chain around my hitch and they yanked me out. I happen to have my new book, my first book, Forgotten Alabama, hadn't come out yet. It wasn't coming out for another 2 months, but I happen to have like an advance copy with me. So I whooped it out and stuck it in their hands and said, "What's the name of this church?" And they looked at it and they looked at each other and they had no clue. So they called Mabel down at City Hall, and Mabel had no clue. And so it's still a mystery until probably about 2, 3 years ago, somebody else actually posted the same church, and he walked around behind it and found the sign leaning against the back wall. And normally people laugh at me when I tell them that story. Just to spare you the details, the name of the church is Little Rock Baptist Church. And finally, down in Lowndes County is a caboose for the Western Railway of Alabama. It's right along Highway 31. You're just going down there, woods, clear space, woods, caboose, and boom, there it is. And it really stands out. Why it was here, I will never know. All I know is probably about 6 months after I took this shot, a friend of mine that lives down in Lower Alabama says, "You know, that caboose is gone." I thought, how could it be gone? This thing weighs 20 tons. It's not like you can, drag your truck in there and tow it off. And anyway, it remained a mystery until maybe 2, 3 months later, he found out what happened. A cattle farm down in Crenshaw County bought this caboose and an old wood caboose and drug them both down to the farm with the intent of fixing them up. As it turns out, they decided they're only going to fix the wood caboose. In fact, I've actually talked to the lady who owns this caboose because she's trying to sell it to me for what she paid for it, which was $1,800. And there was also $10,000 or so shipping and handling. Anyway, I'm going to leave y'all with these final thoughts here. When you go home, or when you're out and about, look around the things you see every day: your church, where where your kids go to school, where you bank. 100 years from now, almost none of these things will exist. Take pictures of everything, because you never know when you were the last person to actually document that something ever existed. You go back and look at an old black and white photograph from 50 years ago, and it's the most fascinating thing you ever saw. But when that photograph was taken 50 years ago, it was probably a pretty mundane subject. Just so you know, I happen to have my books. I have 3 books: Forgotten Alabama, More Forgotten Alabama, and my last one, which came out last July, it's called 200 Years of Forgotten Alabama. And all the photographs you see in these will be in one or more of these books. All you have to do is go to ForgottenAlabama.com and order them, and I'll ship them out the next day. Also, if you happen to do Instagram, I happen to have an Instagram account, and you can follow me there, Instagram.com, Forgotten Alabama 1819. Anyway, that's pretty much it. I appreciate y'all watching. I've had a lot of fun doing Forgotten Alabama. I'm probably by now, I've probably driven, 55,000 miles, all 67 counties multiple times. Like I said earlier, about 45,000 photographs. When I look back on this, and I think, wow, this has been great. I have absolutely no regrets. Just a reminder, I finance my project by selling books, and I happen to have 3 books that you can get at ForgottenAlabama.com. This is my first book, obviously named Forgotten Alabama, catchy title. The much anticipated sequel, which is More Forgotten Alabama. This one, I really like this one. It's really, really a nice book. And then finally, the book that I am most proud of, 200 Years of Forgotten Alabama. This is the one I always wanted to do, and it's bigger than the other 2. I mean, this thing's 264 pages. Now, I mean, it's just chock full of pictures. Look at that. All sorts of cool things here that you would see when I do one of my presentations. So, ForgottenAlabama.com. Order 1, 2, all 3. I will get them out the next day. And anyway, thank y'all for watching. I appreciate you being here. Y'all stay safe and have a good night. Stop.